Everyone. I'm very excited to have this public event today at the University of Texas at Austin, sponsored by the Intelligence Studies Project, the Clement Center for National Security, and the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, which will be discussing one of the most discussed and interesting titles that came out in the field of disinformation last year, and its author has been featured by the mainstream media. The multiple sponsors of this event, including the Global Disinformation Lab, which I'll introduce in a second, and the Bromley Fellowship Program, highlights the interest and the importance of this work, which has been published by the author that will present her book today, titled How to Lose the Information War, Russia Fake News and the Future of Conflict, but also to put forward some of the questions that here at UT faculty, students, practitioners are working on in terms of cognitive resilience. My name is Kirill Avramov, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, and I'm a fellow to the ISP, to the Intelligence Studies Project at LBJ School of Public Affairs, but also I'm part of the Global Disinformation Lab that was established in 2020 at UT Austin in order to encourage collaborative interdisciplinary academic research and on the global circulation of broad spectrum of information, misinformation, disinformation via digital and legacy media. We are very interested actually today in the talk to hear some comments specifically on the examples that are discussed in the case studies in the book. And we deal with weaponized narratives and those harm grades that hopefully we'll have time at the Q&A to discuss. But also in our work, we include students such as the ones part of the Bromley Next Generation Fellowship Program, which provides research training and mentorship opportunities to exceptional graduate students at UT Austin. Strauss Center has currently 11 Bromley Fellows, and one of them will be assisting me today. His name is Jaime Cabrera, who is a second-year Masters of Global Policy student at LBJ School of Public Affairs, where he specialized on internet governance. And at this point of time, without further ado, I would ask Jaime to introduce our very interesting original thinker who will be able to present her book today. Jaime?
Great, thank you so much for that welcome message, and thank you everyone for being here. We're about to start, and I would just wanted to introduce our speaker today, Nina Jankowicz. She studies the intersection of democracy and technology in Central and Eastern Europe. Ms. Jankowicz has advised the Ukrainian government on strategic communications under the auspices of a Fulbright Clinton Public Policy Fellowship. Her writing has been published by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and others. She is a frequent television and radio commentator on disinformation and Russian and Eastern European affairs. Prior to her Fulbright grant in Ukraine, Ms. Jankowicz managed democracy assistance programs to Russia and Belarus at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. She received her MA in Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and her BA from Bryn Mawr College. So thank you so much for being with us, and I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you, Dr. Avramov. It's wonderful to be at UT Austin today. I only wish that I could be with you in person. And before we start, I just want to say that I hope everyone who's listening in today, who's in Texas, is on the up and up, that your families and you are safe. And we've certainly been thinking of you in my household. So just a little bit more about me and my background, which I think gives a good window onto how I came about writing this book. I am the Disinformation Fellow at the Wilson Center, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit think tank in Washington, D.C. We are the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the only president with a PhD. And I think my title, Disinformation Fellow, is probably one of the best titles in Washington. It should probably be Counter Disinformation Fellow, but nobody asked me when they gave me that title. So here we are. And in my work at the Wilson Center, I really try to link up the research I do with policy solutions. So I'm up on the Hill giving testimony to Congress. I brief members of Congress and allied governments. We've hosted workshops with members of parliaments from foreign countries and staffers from Capitol Hill, trying to get into these problems to really learn how to recognize and counter disinformation in a democratic way. And that emphasis on supporting democracy and preserving freedom of speech really comes from my initial work, which Jaime mentioned. Early on in my career, I was the program officer for Russia and Belarus programs at the National Democratic Institute, which is a democracy support organization. And that's really where I got my first exposure to disinformation as a concept. Obviously, you know, academic exposure, learning about how the Soviet Union used disinformation happened during all of my studies. But in terms of practice, NDI was really where I first encountered it. And I joined NDI after the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, had been asked to leave Russia by the Russian government, and NDI was in part funded by USAID. And we became a target of Russian domestic disinformation. There were a lot of hit stories on us and the folks that we partnered with. There were cartoons of us in the Russian media. There were, you know, all sorts of exposés on Russian states-funded media. And as a result, our programs had to leave Russia and operate offshore. And that's when I really started thinking about how do we counter these narratives? How do we get in front of them? How do we be more proactive rather than just constantly responding to the false allegations that the Kremlin was putting out? And then the Ukraine crisis began just a little bit into my time at NDI. And it became clear then that it wasn't just something that the Russian government was using against organizations like NDI. It was a weapon in some ways of war. And certainly in the Ukrainian context, the information war was paired very deliberately with the kinetic war in the Donbass and the illegal annexation of Crimea. And so that's the background that I come through all of this from. My study of disinformation is comparative. I lived in Ukraine for a year as a Fulbright Clinton Fellow, as Jaime said. I was advising the Ukrainian government on strategic communications and really saw firsthand how a government like Ukraine, which unfortunately, you know, was really struggling economically, was struggling in terms of its sovereignty, was still trying to address these issues and was thinking about them in a lot of ways in a more advanced fashion than we were in the West. And I was there at a very consequential time in 2016 and 2017. As the United States and the Western world was really just coming to grips for the very first time with the idea of foreign disinformation, with the revelations of 2016 election interference by the Kremlin in the US election. And I really felt, as I was sitting in Kiev watching all of this happen, waking up day after day to another headline about Russian interference, that we were approaching this problem with a really unique sense of American hubris, that this had never happened before to anyone else, and that we were the first to experience it. It wasn't worth looking at what happened in places like Ukraine or Estonia, or even looking at the historical record of Russia's use of these tactics in decades past, and that we had to kind of reinvent the wheel in order to solve this problem. That was extraordinarily frustrating for me, looking at what Kiev was doing, sitting with my colleagues, my Ukrainian colleagues in the ministry every day, interviewing people around the continent as part of my Fulbright project who were responding to these issues, and seeing how completely disconnected that was from the discourse in the United States. And that's why I decided to write this book. My book, How to Lose the Information War, really brings all of that to bear. It looks at 5 countries: Estonia, Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, not our friends in the state of Georgia, Czech Republic, Poland, and Ukraine. And it also looks at the United States and what we've learned since 2016 and a few more current examples. And it's not focused on as much on the tools and tactics that Russia uses as it is focused on the responses to those tools and tactics, how governments organize themselves, how civil society pitches in to either help or in some cases hinder the efforts that governments are putting forward. And at the core of all of this is the idea that disinformation is a threat to democracy. It's not a partisan issue. It's not something that should be used as political cannon fodder. It's something that affects all of us and our ability to engage with the democratic process. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today, as well as some of the goals of Russian disinformation and some of the main themes from the book, which I think have really been brought into stark relief in the past year as we've dealt with election disinformation, as we've dealt with COVID myths and false narratives related to protests around the United States. And of course, someone is calling me as I give this presentation, and it's coming through on my MacBook. So now I've silenced it. It was probably a spam call because that is the world that we live in. Anyway, so starting with some of the goals of Russian disinformation, which I view in three ways. First, I think there are a lot of people and a lot of misconceptions that think, the Kremlin wants a certain political outcome in the United States or in Germany or in Ukraine. To some extent, that's true in the short term, but when we're talking about the long term, I actually don't buy into that assertion. What I think the Kremlin is looking to do is to undermine Western democracy writ large, and that's shown by the fact that the Kremlin is often playing on both sides of the same issue. We've seen the Kremlin support, for instance, Bernie Sanders as well as Donald Trump. And the idea is to polarize us, to pit us against one another, to create this sense of discontent and chaos in our society. And what does that do? That goes toward the second goal that the Kremlin has, which is when we are consumed by our own problems at home, when we are pit against one another and polarized, we are paying less attention to what the Kremlin is doing abroad, and it's near abroad or perhaps it's far abroad. It's adventurism in places like Ukraine, the Central African Republic, Venezuela, Syria. When we're consumed by our own problems at home, we have less energy, we have fewer resources to spend worrying about what the Kremlin is doing abroad. And then finally, the third goal is domestic in nature. It fuels the Kremlin's whataboutism. Just in a conversation with the Brumley Fellows just now, we were talking a little bit about the decision by Amnesty International to remove Alexei Navalny, the Russian dissident's prisoner of conscience status. Or we could talk, for instance, about how protesters and media were treated during the Black Lives Matter movement this summer. Both of these instances have fueled domestic propaganda that the Kremlin has engaged in at home. And this allows Vladimir Putin and his cronies to say to protesters who might be asking for Navalny's release, or to the folks who were on the streets of the far eastern town Khabarovsk over the summer demanding a more democratic form of governance, he can say to them, it's very nice that you want democracy, but look at what democracy is doing in the United States right now, in that shining city on a hill. How's that working out for them? Aren't you glad that you have order rather than freedom here in Russia? And the same thing could be said of the COVID pandemic and the United States handling of the COVID situation. Russia has been using that in its domestic propaganda as well. And disinformation fuels all three of these goals. Again, the undermining of Western democracy, the distraction from Russia's adventurism abroad, and again, the whataboutism in Russia's domestic information environment. And so the countries I highlight in my book, as I said, teach us three main lessons. The first is that there's a homegrown element to all of the disinformation operations that we're talking about. Just like there's a misconception around Russia wanting a certain political outcome in its disinformation operations, I think there is a large misconception, and this has only become more true as we experienced the 2020 election. There's this misconception that most of the disinformation operations that exist run on trolls and bots, that it's just a bunch of fake accounts and silly memes on the internet, and we can ignore them. Why does anybody buy into them? When in actuality, Russian disinformation, domestic disinformation, any disinformation that we are encountering in today's day and age, and in fact, in decades past as well, runs on emotion. It runs on real grievances in our society that are weaponized in order to get people to feel a certain way, to act even. And I'll give you an example of how this isn't just about Russian trolls. It's about what we call information laundering. So you take a narrative and it is laundered into the authentic American or German or Polish discourse, so that it's a lot more difficult for a social media platform to say, we're going to take action against this post because it's from an authentic local voice. And my favorite story of this is one that's a little bit personal to me, actually. In my free time, as you can probably tell by me using my hands as I speak, I used to do a lot of theater, musical theater. And when I was living in Ukraine, about to come home in July of 2017, I got an ad on my Facebook feed that was advertising a protest in Washington, D.C. on July 4th, 2017. And it was for musical theater lovers to come out dressed in colonial attire and sing, quote, songs of freedom in front of the White House in a protest of Donald Trump. They were going to sing songs from the musical Les Miserables, Do You Hear the People Sing, et cetera, but parody lyrics against the president. And I thought that this was really funny. It was at the point of time where it seemed like everyone was protesting. Scientists were protesting, lawyers were protesting, women were protesting, and the musical theater people also had to find a way in there. And I just thought that was funny. I disregarded it because I was in Ukraine still. And I didn't think about it again for a couple of years until one day, as part of the Russia investigation, a criminal complaint was unsealed in the District of Virginia that I actually live in. And it said that the Internet Research Agency, Russia's infamous troll factory as we know it now, had invested $80 in sponsoring an ad on Facebook that was in support of this very protest itself, that they had spent $80 to support a group called Americans Take Action, which organized the protest, and had no idea that they were interfacing with folks from the Internet Research Agency. And so I tracked down one of the organizers. We met, we had coffee and a long, very detailed conversation. And he had absolutely no clue that when he was planning this protest with a bunch of other protest groups in Washington, D.C., that they had been supported by the Russian government or the proxy of the Russian government. And I think this is really interesting. It shows us a couple things. One, this isn't about just silly memes on the internet, right? It actually got people to show up. And we don't know how many people saw that ad and then got converted into actually showing up on July 4th, 2017. But according to the guy who ran the protest, his name is Ryan, Ryan said, you know, this was one of our most successful protest actions that we did. And these were the folks who stood up at Trump's inauguration with resist written on t-shirts. They unfurled a resist banner from the top rafters of the Washington Nationals ballpark on their home opener. They also handed out Russian flags at the Conservative Political Action Conference, very topical for this week. That was in 2017. And then they did this flash mob as well. And Ryan said that he really thought that advertising, which reached tens of thousands of people in the Washington metro area, did encourage a lot of musical theater loving protesters to come out that day. So that's number one. Number two, what's really interesting about this is, again, this wasn't about something that was only pro-Trump. These folks were vehemently against Trump, and in fact, were calling for his impeachment from the very day he was inaugurated. And so we have this sense, again, of polarization that the Russian government was pushing during that time. And eventually Facebook, when it found out that these events were connected to the Russian government, they took down the events. Ryan said that all the chats that he had with the would-be IRA operatives had been deleted from his history. You couldn't even really find very many videos of the event that were still on Facebook. They are still on YouTube, however. And this is a great example of quite complex social engineering and information laundering again. There's also, this has kind of evolved a little bit as we headed toward the 2020 election last year. And rather than, trying to get people out to protest, what we saw was the use of the infrastructure, the ways that social media has evolved since 2016 in order to, again, tweak public opinion a little bit. And this was most evident in the Peace Data operation, which you may have heard of. It was a blip in the very furious news cycle ahead of the election in around September. And this was an operation that actually contracted with real freelance journalists, left-leaning freelance journalists in the United States, to write articles related to foreign policy, post them on a website, and then drop those links in the website, from the website, to Facebook groups that were left-leaning. So they might have been, for instance, in support of Julian Assange, or in support of the Kurdish army in Syria, or something like that. And these were folks who were very focused. They had a certain political inclination and had created a community around that. And by dropping the links in these Facebook groups where engagement is incentivized, I'm sure you've all noticed that in your own Facebook feeds, that Facebook is really driving you to engage with those groups, they were able to stir up some interest in this website. It didn't get so much engagement before the NSA tipped off Facebook and Twitter and all those properties got taken down, but it's an interesting, again, type of information laundering in kind of two vectors here. One, laundering legitimacy by using real freelance American journalists who got paid for their writing. So it gave it an air of legitimacy in that way. And two, by laundering it through Facebook groups where people could see that link, engage with it, drop it in another group that they're a part of, send it to friends, et cetera, et cetera. It also, interestingly, rather than using a whole bunch of fake accounts, it just used a very small group of fake accounts that had AI-generated profile pictures. So I like to tell this story. It's not in the book, but it shows how our adversaries are adapting their information tactics. Although we are playing what I like to call whack-a-troll right now and, furiously removing fake accounts, our adversaries are still adapting to the new information environment and the hoops that the social media platforms and law enforcement agencies are making them jump through. So again, there's a homegrown element to these operations. The second theme from the book is that because there is a homegrown element to these operations, we really need to invest in the human element to countering disinformation. All of the countries that I look at that have had any success in countering Russia understand that Russia is exploiting fissures in our societies, and that disinformation isn't just about cut and dry fakes. It's about our real visceral emotion. And you can't legislate how people feel, but you can teach them to support their feelings with credible, authoritative information. And there are two examples in the book that I think explore how this can really work. The first is Estonia. I'm not sure exactly how many of you are familiar with the bronze soldier crisis here gathered today, but in a nutshell, Estonia is a small country on the Baltic Sea, about 1.3 million people, that in 1991, when it regained its independence from the Soviet Union, had about 25 to 30% of an ethnic Russian population in Estonia that was left over from the fall of the Soviet Union. And these folks, unfortunately, sort of became second-class citizens in the eyes of the Estonian government. Many of them didn't have Estonian citizenship because they couldn't pass Estonian language exams. They had second-class jobs, essentially blue-collar jobs, because they didn't have a higher education and didn't speak Estonian. They were de facto ghettoized, living in certain parts of the country, in certain parts of the capital, and their children couldn't attend secondary school and university in Estonia because they didn't speak Estonian and grew up in a Russian-speaking household. And so the societal affordances allowed to them were pretty bare, and there were a lot of grievances within the Russian society. And Russia saw this happening, and especially post the accession of Estonia to the European Union and NATO, really saw an opportunity here to exact its influence over a country that was now in the Western orbit, and pursued this policy of really, again, weaponizing the grievances of the ethnic Russian population. And this all came to a head when the Estonian government tried to move a statue to World War II dead from the center of the capital of Estonia, Tallinn, to the outskirts of the city. And Russia essentially fomented a protest through Russian language media and some covert operations in Estonia. It led, unfortunately, to one death and a lot of destruction in the center of the city. And Estonia realized, we have a problem on our hands. They also dealt with a cyber attack, and that's what a lot of people focus on when we're talking about 2007 and what we call the Bronze Soldier crisis in reference to that statue. And Estonia is very, smart about its cybersecurity. It's one of the leaders in cybersecurity and IT in general. They invented Skype. But what I like to focus on from this case study is not the cyber element, although they did beef up their cybersecurity after 2007. It's the human element, the informational element. The response wasn't just in the cyber realm. It wasn't about locking down the information sphere. It wasn't about pushing ethnic Estonians out or fact checking them. It was about reaching out to them and integrating them into society. So investing in Russian language higher educational opportunities, Russian language media, investing in outreach from the government to folks living in Russian enclaves in Estonia. And if you look at the integration statistics, actually, more and more ethnic Russians are adopting an Estonian European identity for themselves. And that's shown in the number of ethnic Russians who now have citizenship, and those, again, who have this self-professed Estonian European identity. And some of that is natural, the older generations dying off, younger generations assuming a more European identity, but there's an upward trend there that is really encouraging and shows that, this isn't just about if you build it, they will come. All of those services existed prior to 2007, but it took an active investment by the Estonian government in these services for people to really get invested and engaged in them. So that's one example. Ukraine has also invested in media literacy in particular, recognizing that their informational problems aren't just about telling a good story, aren't just about, telling a patriotic story in the case of their war with Russia. They are looking to really educate people to navigate a complex and oligarchic information environment. And in partnership with an American NGO called IREX, they have invested in a secondary school education program that throughout the curriculum across Ukraine is teaching Ukrainian students how to discern a trustworthy media source, how to recognize hate speech in that media, how to do a little bit of basic fact checking across the board to discern whether something that is breaking news is trustworthy or not. And they've done this very deliberately because they look to nations like Estonia, like Finland and Sweden that have dealt with informational assaults from Russia in particular for many decades. And those countries all have quite resilient education systems, resilient democracies, and Ukraine decided to prioritize this in their own education system as well. And the statistics there are also encouraging. Students are really retaining that information even months and years after they've first been presented with it. And there's a trickle-up effect as well. When you're teaching students about this stuff, they, by nature of the fact that they go home to their families, talk to their parents about it. And there have also been a couple of pilot projects in Ukraine through libraries that reach out to individuals in their communities, voting age individuals, not just students. And those have shown some positive statistics as well. So here I like to say, if Estonia and Ukraine, two nations that are smaller and less prosperous than the United States, can make these big investments in people and the very human problems at the core of disinformation, then the United States and other Western democracies should absolutely be doing the same thing. So first, again, homegrown element. Second, there needs to be a human element to our solution. And then finally, we cannot fight disinformation when we are embracing its tactics ourselves. And there are two really stark examples of this in my book. One is Poland. Poland is an interesting case study for me because I am Polish American in part. And every time I go to Poland, when I was researching disinformation and researching my book in particular, I was told over and over, Poland is inoculated to Russian disinformation. We are immune. Nothing can touch us with that. We're not going to fall for Russian lies. But what's interesting is that Poland has, in many regards, not only fallen for Russian narratives, but also fallen for domestic disinformation that has now become endemic to the Polish political environment. The biggest political issue for many of the past decade or so in Poland, many of the years of the past decade or so in Poland, has been related to the Smolensk plane crash in 2010 that killed about 100 members of the Polish political elite, and conspiracy theories surrounding that plane crash, that the opposition in Poland worked with the Russian government to bring down the plane so that they could achieve a political coup, and that is why Russia is withholding the wreckage from Poland. And the governing party, Law and Justice, has really used that narrative to propel themselves to power. And until very recently, it was one of the main refrains in Polish politics, and was a truly divisive issue in something that should have and was at the very beginning a tragedy for the Polish public, that should have brought people together. It really became a polarizing issue in Poland, and Russia has succeeded in driving narratives related to anti-Ukrainian sentiment and homophobic sentiment, again, two sentiments that exist naturally in Poland, in some parts of Poland, and they've weaponized those narratives, and Poland, unfortunately, has not been immune. But more troubling to me is the fact that the Law and Justice government has actually embraced some of the very tactics that Russia uses as well. Whenever there is discontent in Polish society or a protest movement, we have seen the Law and Justice government invest in its own troll factories, to astroturf, and try to create the guise of grassroots support online for some of their more controversial policy positions, including their anti-abortion stance or anti-gay stance, for instance. And while the Polish government has some pretty good foreign disinformation policies related to Russia, if you look at their national security doctrine and the systems that they have set up across their government, you can't you can't be a kettle calling the pot black, right? When you are fighting disinformation, you're either against it in all of its forms, or you are tacitly or perhaps explicitly endorsing it. And in the Law and Justice Party's case, we have exactly that, this attempted bifurcation of the two policies. But you can't be against Russian disinformation and use those tactics yourself. So there's a tension there in Poland, and that means that they're really not addressing the domestic disinformation situation, which allows Russia an opening to continue to manipulate public discourse in Poland. And a similar thing is happening in the Republic of Georgia right now, and it couldn't be more timely that we're talking about it today, as just this week, opposition leader Nika Melia was arrested by the governing Georgian Dream Party. It's, again, a similar situation to Poland, except even though the Georgian government, again, has pretty robust counter-disinformation policies in their national security doctrine, what we've seen is less of an informational influence coming from Russia and more of a cultural and economic influence. And I think this is a really important point. We tend to think of disinformation as something that just happens online, but there is a whole dark underworld of corruption and of other mechanisms and vectors of influence that support disinformation, from cultural organizations to think tanks to money laundering operations. And that's very clear in Georgia, where the Georgian Dream government basically has ignored the fact that Russia has annexed 20% of Georgian territory illegally and has begun to cooperate with them on cultural issues, has endorsed the Ruski Mir Foundation, which is essentially a front for Russian influence in many countries, particularly through the Orthodox Church. And we've seen Russian investment increasing in Georgia, which you could say that there is, a calculation to be made there. Of course, Georgia is much smaller than Russia, needs Russian investment in its wine and travel industries in particular to survive. But we've seen an increased opening for Russian influence that many, many Georgians are against. And now with the crackdown, not only on opposition figures like Melia, but on opposition media, it is really leaking into the informational and political sphere. And, folks in the Department of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs can say that they're combating Russian disinformation, but it's leaking in through other levers of influence in the country. And that brings us to the United States, my last point for today. I think over the past 4 years, we have been incredibly focused, and rightly so, on the attempted foreign influence in our elections and in our political discourse. And there's a few points that I'll make there. One, as we have seen, it's not just about trolls and bots. We have seen information being laundered into our authentic American discourse through a number of levers, but on both sides of the political spectrum over the past 4 years. So we need to look inward. We need to understand that the grievances in our society, the lack of good governance, the polarization, issues like endemic misogyny, endemic racism, these are issues that our adversaries can weaponize against us and have weaponized against us. And those are the issues we really need to look inward and fix in order to address the problem of foreign interference. We also have much broader problems domestically related to, social media infrastructure, the attention economy, the fact that, the emotional currency is what these social media platforms are making money on and incentivizing, not only for foreign actors to be able to target us to a very precise level of detail, but that domestic actors are increasingly using as well. And that was the main tension during the Trump years for me as a disinformation scholar, very similar to what we see in Poland and Georgia. There are very good people in the United States government trying to deal with these foreign policy problems related to disinformation, but we've seen so many of our own politicians not even tacitly just supporting these issues, but actively engaging in these very tactics that the United States cannot and should not stand for. So again, I'll return to what I started with. Disinformation is not a partisan problem. It is a democratic one, small d. It affects all of us. It affects our participation in the democratic process, because without authoritative information, we can't make informed choices at the ballot box. People are going to get distrustful of institutions. They're going, as we've seen with the COVID pandemic, frankly, they are going to disengage from not only democratic discourse, but from one another. And I think we really need to look toward those human investments as we try to heal from what's been going on in our information space over the past 4 years, and more recently on January 6th in the Capitol, and really start to make long-term generational investments so that our democracy can be based in fact again, and that we can create a more equitable discourse for everybody. So I think we'll stop there. I'm really looking forward to your questions, and thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you very much, Nina. This is a fantastic presentation, and we are very, very glad to have you here today. As you'll see, questions start piling up from our participants in the Q&A section, and please do so for those of you that want to address Nina. Nina, before we open the floor and I pass it to Jaime to address those questions to you, first of all, I think we appreciate the fact that your book is one of those that stands out of the recent publications, or large number of publications dedicated on disinformation, because not only it does not only first identify the problems, but also provides solutions. And moreover than that, it's not only a compliment, but also talks about what you mentioned about the human dimension, not only technical solutions to political problems. And before I pass the floor to Jaime, with the questions, I would like to ask you about your impressions beyond what's already in the book, which I encourage people to read and think through those case studies about the successful and unsuccessful state and society responses, because it's a whole society and approach actually in engaging this really important question that will stay with us for a very long time. But what are since in the lab that I have mentioned in the Intelligence Studies project, and the lab actually, I think you'll appreciate, it's housed in the Center of Russian and Eastern European Studies here at UT Austin, very thoughtful of our university to engage regional expertise. But what are the narratives in terms of themes that you think are the most harmful ones as per targets, as per your case studies? What are the ones that are getting or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the most harmful narratives are the ones that really target people's, in some cases, legitimate distrust toward institutions. the Estonian case study comes to mind, but we've also seen this in Ukraine over and over again. Of course, Ukrainians have been through a lot over the past 30 to 35 years, several revolutions, a lot of corruption. They have a lot of well-placed distrust toward government. And one thing that was clear when I was covering the 2019 election in Ukraine, even though it was one of the cleanest elections, if not the cleanest election that Ukraine ever had, and there was no evidence of fraud, people still really wanted to see their ballot go into the box. They wanted the evidence, that their vote was going to be counted, that their voice was going to be heard, and that cascades to other parts of Ukrainian society as well. There's just a widespread distrust toward the government, and so when we look at the narratives that have targeted Ukraine from the Internet Research Agency and from other Russian disinformation outlets and vectors over the past few years, it's a lot about corruption. It's a lot about far-right figures in Ukraine. It's a lot about folks who, are in general benefiting from the system, even outside of the basic corruption landscape, in kind of personal ways as well. And I think that those are the most resonant narratives for people. And that's what's pretty ingenious about the Russian strategy. You can look at the Russian ads that were bought in 2016 and say, okay, their English isn't very good, or like, these are kind of weird. Did they really resonate with people? But clearly, Russia's good at identifying those issues, those real grievances that have some resonance with people, even if the English is a little bit silly or the memes are a bit off color. There is real distrust, real dismay in a lot of societies, particularly right now during COVID, a lot of uncertainty and fear. And I think Russia has gotten very practiced at identifying those particular flashpoints. And so in Ukraine, it might be distrust toward the government. In the United States, that manifests itself a little bit differently in the form of anti-racism and racism on both sides of the aisle. We've seen some protests about gun rights or Texas secessionists in some cases. So they're really widely held beliefs that are flashpoints in society that I think are the most dangerous. And that's why we see, when there is a big event like Black Lives Matter, or even, I was reading an article earlier today about how Russia Today and Sputnik were portraying the weather disaster in Texas. That's why we see Russia glomming on to these big hot button events, because they're easy to manipulate.
Thank you for commenting on this, because obviously we agree that the strategies in targeting disinformation and micro-segmenting different strata of society obviously touch upon those very powerful emotions: fear, disgust, rage, and we know for sure that. I think there is another point of agreement that recently have published, very recently actually, a paper on the gendered and sexualized weaponized narrative, something that here we do as well with our colleagues. And we believe that actually part of those narratives are the ones also that reach the targets easily, and unfortunately are widespread and are digested. Before we pass on to Jaime, and I hope our cameras will come back on as well, so you can see our faces. I wanted to ask about your impressions, whether when dealing with Russian disinformation, are we dealing with a strategy that targets one size fits all, or you're seeing more segmented approach per target?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a segmented approach, because if you look, even just among the 5 case studies and the main narratives chosen by the Kremlin to really hone in on, it's different in every country. So Estonia obviously went for the ethnic and linguistic fissures. In Georgia, it was about Georgia's sense of pride and its sovereignty. Czech Republic was anti-migrant sentiment. Poland, as I mentioned before, related to Smolensk, related to anti-LGBT, anti-Ukrainian sentiment. And I've left out Ukraine, of course, which we were just talking about, anti-NATO, anti-West, anti-government writ large. And there's a lot of, if you have a more diverse society, like in the United States, for instance, you have a lot of micro segmentation there. And what's interesting is that Russia has gotten very, I don't even want to say they've gotten very good. They use the tools available to them on social media platforms to micro-target their messaging. And that's not even just through advertising. You don't need to have a credit card to do this sort of micro-targeting on social media. Now that we have segmented populations, ready-made attack vectors through things like Facebook groups, which are, again, segmented by interest, by vulnerability, and provide an easy in for any malign actor, whether domestic or foreign. And that segmentation is really important. It allows malign actors to test their narratives, to figure out what works. And I like to describe the Russian strategy in particular as a little bit more like throwing spaghetti at the wall. They're happy to throw a lot of spaghetti at the beginning and kind of see what sticks. And once they find that sticky spot on the wall and that sticky sort of pasta, they're going to keep throwing it over and over and over again. And that's the structure that social media affords, not only, again, for Russia, but for anybody who wants to influence discourse online anywhere.
Thank you for addressing this. Yes, definitely. Jaime, as the questions are, and I'm really happy that we're having such an interest in so many questions, I'm going to ask you to address them from our Q&A session. Jaime?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Nina. That was excellent as always. I'm going to start with this question from Brian McDowell. He's asking, how do we respond effectively when one of the main divisions in our country is polarization, and certainly of our partisan political identity? He says, how do we make this nonpartisan, bipartisan issue?
Yeah, this is one of the things that is the most difficult. And I'm going to pin a lot of the blame here on Congress, actually. I think our elected leaders need to recognize that disinformation is not a partisan issue. And we need to hear them actively calling out disinformation when it happens, rather than engaging in it themselves. This is something I've said over and over when I'm up on the Hill testifying. It is something that has really weighed on me in the wake of the Capitol insurrection in particular, that not only have we seen members of Congress endorse conspiracy theories about election integrity during the 2020 election, we saw them that very night double down on those theories after they had just had their lives threatened by people who bought into them. And I wanted to say on the Hill, but it was a virtual hearing in October with the House Intelligence Committee. And unfortunately, no Republicans showed up to that meeting. I would have loved to have engaged with the folks on the House Intelligence Committee about those issues, but only the Democratic members showed up. And even there was some incredulity about the idea that what was said in Congress, the disinformation that was laundered through Congress, could have an effect on offline action. I said disinformation is dismantling democracy, and I was actually challenged by one of the members who said, can you give me an example? And I pointed to two things at that point in October of 2020, the kidnapping plot against Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and recent revelations about how disinformation narratives were targeted at Black voters through micro-targeting on social media. That wasn't enough for that particular member. And I thought of him on January 6th when folks were storming the Capitol and we saw the consequences of these conspiracy theories. So something I try to do in my work, again, is push this idea that disinformation is not a partisan issue, and we all really need to stand up for the truth. Even if it doesn't benefit you politically in the short term, the implications for democracy in the long term are stark. In terms of what we can do as normal people in bridging that political divide, because it's hard to be too optimistic about Congress sometimes. We, I think, need to think of this in emotional terms again, and this can be really frustrating for people. I know, especially folks who have relatives or friends who have essentially been radicalized. we need to come at this from a very compassionate point of view. So a lot of the folks who study communications, who are communication scholars or radicalization scholars, point to de-radicalization literature in this case. It's not about fact-checking people. It's not about engaging in a flame war in comments and saying, here's what Snopes or PolitiFact says. What I would suggest you do, and what the experts say to do, is to actually approach those people privately in a direct message, a text message, a phone call, and say, hey, I saw you shared this article. I was wondering what led you to share it, to be interested in it, and really try to understand what motivates them, to get to the root of the problem, the grievance that led them there. And then you can try to gently steer them toward more reputable resources that might be supportive of their argument, but at least based in fact, or at least understanding from an emotional human point of view what's driving them to that particular content. Because often it is grounded in something real. And if you can address that, if you can make them feel heard, that will slowly take them back from kind of that precipice. It's a long process. And I personally have, just full disclosure, have not had success with it with the loved ones in my life who have gone that direction. It takes real dedication, and I've not gotten to that point with them yet, where we're able to engage for that long period of time. But just getting into an argument about it isn't the way to go. So de-escalating and seeing the humanity in one another, I think, is really important, and something that I do on Twitter when I am targeted by people who vehemently disagree with me, is I try to connect with them on that human level as well, to de-escalate. So I think we could all use a little bit of a reminder that, there is a person behind the avatar, and that we're in a really difficult situation, that everybody is going through something difficult right now amid the coronavirus pandemic, and remembering that shared humanity is the best thing that we can do. I know that's kind of woo-woo, but but it is important.
I think that's spot on, and I think most of us can relate to maybe one family member or one person that we know of that it's hard to engage with them, and the first reaction we have is, as you said, give them the facts, or like give them just a link, and it's easy for us to just like, oh, just look at the Times or the Washington Post or something like that, but that's not going to do a lot, and we need to do it on a human level. And as a tangent from that, I was thinking that it's another level when you have other people that you have to engage with. Like in my case, my parents both speak Spanish only, right? And one of the attendees is asking, are countries more culturally homogeneous and smaller are better suited to fight discrimination than large, culturally heterogeneous, decentralized countries?
That's an interesting question. So obviously we have examples like Finland and Sweden, which are smaller and very, very homogeneous, and have had a bit of an easier time with some of the issues related to disinformation. And I think, there's evidence that that's because they have fewer fissures to manipulate from the outside. That being said, there are some heterogeneous countries like Australia, like Canada, even the United Kingdom, although they have dealt with disinformation more than the other two that I mentioned, they have a more coherent government response, I would say, generally speaking, than the United States does. And we are larger than all three of those countries. Of course, we are more heterogeneous. We have more languages. We have more cleavages in the society. And it's something that we're proud of, right? But we're clearly not doing our best by that diversity, by those different ethnicities and races in our country right now. And I think that we all need to take a long, hard look and recognize that these aren't just domestic problems, they become national security problems as well. And I think that's been laid out pretty bare by the revelations about white supremacy in our military, for example. And this is something that I've been pretty passionate about speaking about since 2017, when the Charlottesville protests happened and the unfortunate death of Heather Heyer. We saw a lot of people in the wake of that protest. And of course, this was not long after the 2016 election. So Russia was very en vogue at that point. But lot of people speculating about Russian involvement with the Unite the Right rally. And that really dismayed me. The fact that we as Americans couldn't look in the mirror and recognize that racism has been a plague on our country since its founding, and that we don't need another country, a foreign country, to impose or import racism to the United States, that it exists, and that these tendencies exist in our society, and we're being amplified and endorsed by the commander-in-chief to some extent. And so that is something that I think we really need to start to interrogate a lot better. And yeah, it is, unfortunately, it makes us a little bit more vulnerable, but I don't think it means that it's impossible to address some of these issues. We just need to recognize that we do have these problems and actively work in a holistic way. One of the big themes of the book, aside from the ones that I highlighted already, is that the government responses that exist need to really be joined up. So when we talk about disinformation, it's not just something that concerns the State Department or the Department of Defense or Department of Homeland Security. It should include the Department of Education, the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Arts. It should include the Housing and Urban Development Department, right? All the departments that actually work with people, real Americans, getting them involved, because they deal with these issues that become those flashpoints for disinformation narratives. And too often we think in this very segmented way about these problems. And it is a whole of society problem that needs a whole of society, whole of government solution.
Definitely. And when you're talking also about, how we've seen the difference between, how at first it seemed like it was only happening online, right? It was only happening, it was a problem for maybe media companies or technology companies, and that's it. But as Patrick Herndon is asking, how does disinformation contribute to the transformation from narrative radicalization to kinetic radicalization, for example, in domestic terrorism? And I think we saw it all most recently on the events of January 6th.
Yeah, absolutely, we did. And I am not a radicalization scholar, but from what I've read and what I've observed myself, certainly we see an offline effect from what people are consuming online. Obviously, to some extent, they stay pretty centralized at the beginning in whatever group they're a part of, but this can have real offline kinetic manifestations, whether that is the organization of protests, which we saw across the United States during 2020, from the Reopen movement, which got violent in a couple of places, to counter protests against Black Lives Matter, to January 6th, and the events that led up to it. We see, especially among far-right groups, this militarization or militarized rhetoric. And I wrote a piece, gosh, what month was that? September, I think, after the first presidential debate, where we saw President Trump using very militarized rhetoric in his advertising, and then asking his supporters to go out and go and watch at counting centers and at polling stations. And as someone who has done many election observation missions, that's exactly the type of rhetoric that we would be worried about if we were in the Republic of Georgia or Ukraine or Russia. We would, as an election observer, write that up in a report, right? And so I think there was kind of a perfect storm for what we saw in the United States over the past couple of years, in that we had this highly polarized media environment that was essentially leading people to this offline action that was also amplified on many official levels and endorsed on many official levels, which led to the normalization of that and endorsement of that sort of behavior and rhetoric. And it's going to take a long time to walk back from that. I had the unfortunate position of needing to react to the events of January 6th on TV and on radio as I was processing it myself as a resident of Washington, and as a disinformation scholar, and as an American. And I'm still not very optimistic. I think things have calmed down now, but the problem is far from over. And we have to recognize the link between online discourse and offline action. We recognized it when we were talking about terrorism, right? That's one of the few places where social media platforms have actually banded together and been able to really make a dent in extremist content. But when it comes to the domestic terrorism that we're seeing, we've yet to really wrap our heads around it. And that's in part because this issue has become so politicized. It is baked into the fabric of our politics right now. And I really hope we can take a few steps back from that viewpoint, because it is a public safety issue. I was about to say it's becoming a public safety issue. It is a public safety issue. It's a public health issue, and it has implications for our democratic infrastructure as well.
Yeah, and in your book, you make an emphasis on the government response to this, but you also don't let the technology sector, especially social media platforms, off the hook. Like you mentioned it right at the end of the book. So, and we have someone asking, well, as we see people leaving Facebook from these kind of like quote unquote public forums and information spheres, pushing more towards private communication, and be it, like Skype or Telegram, Discord, and all these other platforms, does this isolate them from the human element of how we can, combat disinformation? What's your take on this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one that I've been thinking about for a couple of years. Even though this new migration has just started in the United States, it's been happening in other countries for a little bit. You and I were just talking about WhatsApp in Mexico, for instance. Those encrypted messaging platforms are extraordinarily popular in Ukraine as well, and have become vectors for disinformation. We've seen WhatsApp used in Brazil and in India. And the migration to these platforms has been going on for a long time. There has been some successful intervention. There have been a couple of attempts to inject like large WhatsApp broadcast groups or other groups with fact checks. So if a spurious narrative or picture or a link is being shared, the fact checkers who have kind of infiltrated those groups will send them a fact check. That's interesting. There have been some attempts by platforms like WhatsApp to limit the number of forwards that you can use so that misinformation can't go quite as viral as it has just by forwarding it to your entire contact list, which was a problem in India and Brazil. But in terms of reaching people, what's really interesting, actually, two things about these platforms that I think actually, they don't worry me as much as the extraordinarily ubiquitous platforms like TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. The first is that their user interface is very poor. If any of you have looked around on Parler or Gab, I mean, it's not a very good platform, especially when we're talking about older people. They're going to have a hard time using it. And when the user experience is bad, they're just going to go back to Facebook. The other thing that drives them to platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, is the fact that a lot of the polarized rhetoric that we're seeing, the trolling and harassment in particular, needs to happen in a place where the targets of that trolling, harassment, and abuse exist. So in our study that Dr. Avramov mentioned related to gender and disinformation, we looked at 6 social media platforms, Twitter, Reddit, Gab, 4chan, 8kun, and Parler. And almost all of the data that we gathered over the course of 2 months about 13 female politicians was on Twitter. And our hypothesis, although we can't exactly prove this because we can't interview all of the users sharing these vitriolic comments, our hypothesis is that people like to yell at their targets rather than just about them. And so when we're talking about a lot of these abusive or polarized conversations, they are happening in the public platforms or the more ubiquitous platforms more frequently. When it comes to the really, really radicalized stuff or like the planning of individual events and things like that, we are seeing those happen in closed spaces, but it doesn't necessarily matter that they're closed groups on Facebook versus an encrypted messenger versus some other sort of forum. I hope now, after January 6th, we have a light bulb moment in our law enforcement and intelligence gathering entities in the government, that we are going to be paying a lot more attention to the online chatter and taking it seriously, whether it's on one of these alternative platforms or whether it's on the more ubiquitous ones like Facebook and Twitter.
I agree, and I want to go back to this, like the efforts that we've done so far. And you have this term, and it's whack-a-troll, that I love, and I've used it in some of my assignments in school already, because it's true. Like some of these efforts that we have is mostly just kind of like whatever pops out, we just try to like dissolve it as quickly as possible, but we don't think of the long term, right? So I was just wondering, like in the same sense of, you know, like all these measures that we can take immediately, what is it that can be seen as an immediate action, like something that we can do right now, whether legislation or some form of executive action that we can take, but is going to prepare us for the long run for preventing this and like in the future?
So I am hesitant to prescribe any legislative action that will have an immediate effect. I think we need to be really careful about the legislation that we enact related to disinformation, because it has free speech implications. And I think we should be really circumspect about those conversations. And we haven't been so far. They've still been fueled almost entirely by politics. So I'm hoping that those conversations begin to happen. What needs to support those conversations is transparency from the platforms. We still trust the social media platforms about how many takedowns they're doing, about the content of those takedowns, about the reasoning for those takedowns. I think we need to have some congressionally mandated transparency and oversight related to content moderation policies and perhaps algorithms as well. And then we can start to have a fact-based conversation about regulation. Right now, we don't have any of that. So that's number one. On the government side of things, I have come around to the idea of having a centrally based kind of disinformation czar. The New York Times a couple of weeks ago used the term reality czar, and I thought that was extraordinarily unhelpful. But somebody related whose job it is to be kind of the central node for a bunch of different spokes across the government that are dealing with issues related to disinformation. The UK actually has something called fusion doctrine, where they address these issues this way. I think we should establish something like this, probably in the National Security Council. Although if Biden wanted to elevate it to cabinet level, I could see that working, although I'm not certain it's necessary. But in the NSC, who has convening power across the interagency community, who can bring together folks from all of those departments I mentioned before, who can bring in the intelligence community and ask what they're seeing, and who can drive a strategy related to how the US government, both on a domestic and foreign scale, is going to address the disinformation problem. Because right now we have a lot of good things kind of happening in parallel to one another, and not as much of a united strategy as I think we need, being that we are the United States. We should be leading this conversation, not following. And we've, in many cases, especially in the kind of international sphere, allowed other nations to fill the vacuum that the United States left during the Trump years on many issues of foreign policy, but in particular on disinformation. So I think we've got to get that strategy together, and it's important that we do it now and think about it on all of these levels: the national security level, the domestic human level, the education level, all of these things. And we've yet to do that. So that would be my number one kind of item on my wish list.
Yeah, and also, I mean, we keep talking about state-sponsored disinformation, and we keep thinking about these operations that ultimately have a goal, right? And one of the things that it's easy to see, I guess, is, well, like if it's election, it's probably a political end. But then with COVID-19, we've also had our fair share of misinformation in the same topic. And someone is asking also, what are your thoughts concerning misinformation, either domestic or foreign, about COVID-19 vaccine? Have we seen foreign actors target certain groups within the US to shape the opinion of the vaccine? What do you think about this?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of hubbub about coronavirus misinformation since the very beginning of the pandemic. And for me, it was kind of a well, duh moment. Like, of course, we're going to see Russia and China in particular using this as a moment to undermine the United States. And I don't think there's a supremely nefarious goal here. I don't think the idea is to kill as many Americans as possible. I think it's more of a public diplomacy goal. We've seen Russia in particular investing a lot in public relations related to its Sputnik vaccine. We saw Russia sending mask diplomacy around the world. So they sent to Italy a bunch of PPE and ventilators, same to the United States. Those ventilators later caught on fire. But it was certainly a PR coup for them, and the Russian media covered that. The United States, which as recently as 2013 was giving medical aid to Russia, now was receiving medical aid from Russia, and that was an important headline for Russia to get. So I think we've been seeing some of that. There's a difference in how Russia's disinformation related to COVID has flourished and what China's looks like. China is more about painting the Chinese Communist Party in a positive light, painting their pandemic response in a positive light, than it is about undermining the United States. And we've seen Russia and Russian entities like Sputnik, RT, and some of the kind of fifth column entities, you might call them, gongos, government organized NGOs and think tanks and things like that, spreading theories about microchips and vaccines and 5G and stuff like that. That goes to more of that Russian disinformation strategy writ large to undermine the American democratic system, and China's goals are much more reflexive, I would say, in that regard. And it operates just like any other hot button event. If there's a narrative or a grievance or a fissure, a sense of distrust that is percolating in US society, Russia's going to identify that, and it's going to amplify it through the means that it has at its disposal.
Is there a point, and this is something that I've been wondering too, because we do see this narrative of foreign influence here in the United States, but it seems to just, integrate completely, and then it stops being completely, foreign, and it's just born here in the United States, and the same ideologies that started from there are just, propagating without the help of anything else. How do we think about this in the context of education, where even like professors and teachers and as we were talking earlier, older people too, who also need to educate in this context, like how do we prevent this now native way of thinking and very polarized thinking to going into the education system when we can't even agree in some states about whether we should teach evolution or creationism, right? So it seems to be a public discourse, but in reality, there's something that it is a fact and cannot be put out there as as a discussion topic.
Yeah, it's difficult, particularly in our federal education system. We can't mandate that schools or states teach things a certain way. But one thing that I've been encouraging is a federal grant program that uses an approved curriculum or approves different curricula that states or civil society organizations, libraries come up with related to disinformation. And I think that should be completely nonpartisan and devoid of politics. Again, there are standards for how to approach information literacy. They have nothing to do with politics. Any disinformation education curriculum that we come up with shouldn't focus only on one foreign actor or one domestic political actor. I think the variety of hucksters, the rainbow of hucksters that exist in the online ecosystem is quite, multicolored and varied. And there are a lot of people who are willing to take advantage of folks who don't have the greatest information literacy skills online. So the same way that we have learned as a society to not give our social security number to a prank call, or not even a prank call, a illegitimate call that's coming from the Social Security Administration, or we've learned not to respond to the email from the Nigerian prince offering us $1 million. We need those same sorts of reflexes developed for the digital age. And I think everybody should want to have those reflexes, to learn how to be a good digital citizen. I'm not saying that it's incumbent on us to solve this problem as individuals. We need help from social media platforms, from the government, from civil society organizations. Again, it's a whole of society response, but it is clear that some people aren't aware that they're being manipulated by folks who are in it for profit, for power, or for political gain.
And as you said, we do need help with this. It's not just a U.S. problem, and that's the biggest thing. It's not this. The United States is not alone in combating this problem. And just recently, Australia passed a law where it changed the way Facebook was interacting also with their users. And that's kind of like the next thing that I wanted to know from you. If we keep on this track, would we be seeing social media platforms shaped by other countries' legislation if we don't act fast, or do you think the United States will, have its own ecosystem regardless, because the companies are based here in the US?
So we're starting to see what some analysts and scholars are kind of calling the splintering of the internet. We saw this a little bit with Germany's NetzDG law, which was passed in 2018, and then GDPR, which was 2019, if I'm not mistaken. What has resulted is that the internet and social media platforms look different in a lot of different countries. And I think I've always argued that the United States has a role to play here because, as you said, we are the headquarters for these companies. The regulations that we put into place are going to have ripple effects around the world. The standard that we set will be emulated by other countries. And so far, what we've seen from the social media companies is that they are much more responsive to the English-speaking, America-centric context than they are to a context in Burma or in Ukraine or in Brazil, although Brazil is a pretty big market for them, so they do respond to Brazil more than some other countries. And I think it's important that we understand that responsibility when we regulate. I doubt that we will see copycat legislation, although there is some talk of introducing a similar bill to what Australia has. In the United States, I think we have, just because of our unique First Amendment environment, different considerations to what a lot of these other countries have. For instance, the NetzDG bill in Germany has very, very strict restrictions on freedom of speech. Basically, anything that is potentially considered contrary to German law can be removed from the platforms and has to be removed within a certain time period, or the platforms risk a huge fine. I don't think we'll see that sort of action in the United States, but I think the fact that we're getting outpaced by a lot of other countries is beginning to wear on legislators, and there is a sense of pressure that we need to act now. And my caution again would be the same, that it's not just about regulating the social media environment, and we need to do that slowly and thoughtfully if we do it, and we need to do it based on data and truth, number one. But we also need to think more holistically about investments in education, about investments in public media. We haven't talked at all really about public media and the role that they play in the information environment. And in the book, I cite some statistics about trust in the BBC in Britain, and how across political parties, I think it's something like 68% of Britons trust the BBC in a time of crisis. And I can't think of a single outlet in the United States, even PBS and NPR, which do have high levels of trust, that have such a high level of trust across political parties in the United States. And the fact that we only spend $1.35 per person per year on our federal allocations for PBS and NPR, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, I think is really abysmal. And injecting an authoritative source of information, authoritative and independent source of information into our information environment is one of the most important investments that we could make for this day and age. And I think the last year has only driven that home even further. So it's not just about the social media environment, even though that's our knee-jerk reaction and we have a huge responsibility there. We also need to think about how to foster democratic discourse in a more holistic way as well.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, it's hard when you can't even have like a place to go that, you know, as you said, it's authoritative and it's independent. So there's no central like line to begin with, right? You need to like find and see for yourself what seems to be right and what seems to be left. And it's not just a problem here in the US. One of the comments and the questions that we have from the audience, it's taken from the labeling practice that social media like undertook recently. And they're saying, well, we have seen positive results in media scrutiny as social media, you know, consumers that RT informs consumers that RT, for example, is state-run media, right? And we've seen it in YouTube, we've seen it in other places. Do you think this labeling practice is a good way to go, or does it, as I think you mentioned in your book, or does it just tell the other people, well, the rest of the content is good, only the label is bad?
Right. So those are slightly different approaches. The state-sponsored labels I actually think are good for adding context. I've come into a couple of situations where people who are quite smart and well-read, but maybe not up on, you know, their government propaganda outlets, don't realize that RT, especially after its rebrand, where it used to be Russia Today and is now RT, they don't recognize that it, at least before, that it was Russian disinformation, Russian propaganda, or state-sponsored media. So I think those labels are helpful in that regard. What you're referencing is the implied truth effect, and that was about fact-checking labels. So slightly different here because it was talking about, okay, this has been fact-checked and it's been found to be true or false, and folks who engaged with that content and then saw other content that didn't have that fact-checking label assumed that the stuff that didn't have the fact-check label was in fact true. So we get into a difficult situation here, and I think we've seen this a little bit in the aftermath of the election last year, where we have a problem of scale. We can't fact check everything. The social media companies are not investing the money and resources, human and monetary, that they need to do that. And frankly, it would be a very difficult thing to do, undertaking in general. So they have to prioritize the most visible content, the most engaged with content. And my dog agrees. So they started doing that with some of the official tweets coming from the president, coming from other high follower accounts, but that left a lot of other mis and disinformation percolating on the platforms that then could get amplified by those accounts. And we run into this just constantly whack-a-troll, chasing your tail problem. Labeling, however, in the American context, I think is probably the most palatable solution to most people. We don't want to see the platforms becoming arbiters of truth, as they like to say. So labeling and adding context where applicable is an amenable solution without violating people's First Amendment rights. The other idea is that you limit the distribution or engagement on those pieces of content. So we saw, for instance, President Trump's tweets sometimes get limited in terms of retweets or responses to them. I think that's pretty smart. We've seen Facebook kind of suppress some content like the Plandemic video, which had some harmful misinformation related to COVID in there. I think that is within the realm of the First Amendment without really, taking away people's right to freedom of speech. I always like to say, especially when we're talking about harassment and things like that, you have a right to go protest on the square, but do you have a right to have a megaphone that reaches tens of millions of Americans at any given time? No, you don't. And so as some people say, freedom of speech is not freedom of reach. And so the labeling contributes to that, as does changing the way that people engage with that content on platforms that's been found to be false, or that is found to come from a non-authoritative source, to use diplomatic terms.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad, first of all, I'm so glad that you have addressed so many of the questions, because we're closing near time, and we're trying to get as much as possible information out of you from every different angles. Also, please excuse my technical difficulties with the camera, so you weren't able to see me. But I'm glad that you have touched upon basically every single aspect and everything in the book, and you had the patience with us in our auditorium to talk about. And certainly we have a number of questions that are still incoming. However, that only just signifies how important and timely this work is. Again, I want to reiterate how much I sympathize with you about the human approach, about working with people, not only seeking for technical solutions for, frankly, political problems, and how important the topics and the themes that you talked about today actually are related with the future of political warfare, and specifically as the topics that we work on at the Intelligence Studies Project, how much, what kind of gravity do they have, for the future of intelligence work and for national security in general. At this point of time, I think we have exhausted you, so we're going to thank you very much one more time for a wonderful presentation, and thank you, Nina. And for everyone, also to our audience who has been today with us and has placed their questions, I would like to invite everyone in the series on March 24th for the rescheduled meeting with Dr. Sean McFeet for the New Rules of War, How America Can Win Against Russia, China, and Other Threats. He's a senior fellow at Atlantic Council, where we will continue with the topics which we started with Nina Jankowicz. And certainly some of those questions that you had today will carry on. Thank you very much, audience, and Nina, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.